Welcome to another episode of the Share Life podcast. And this discussion, I'm speaking with David Koyzis. David, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
David is the author of Political Visions and Illusions, a survey and Christian critique of contemporary ideologies. David holds a PhD in government and international studies from the University of Notre Dame, taught undergraduate political science for 30 years. David, in this particular book, argues that what we believe about politics matters. In a unique and overarching way, David synthesizes the ideologies and what he calls the idolatries of liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, democratism, socialism into a larger meta story. He explains these ideologies' points of view where they aim to provide a redemptive human story and how their redemptive story fails to recognize the deeper problem and achieve their particular political ambitions. The book is a wonderful framework for navigating politics while also transcending the emotional pull that comes in political crises or deeply rooted political belief-based discussions. We're often driven by these ideologies without even recognizing how they're fueling our point of view and behavior. So let's jump right in, David. As a way to explain some of the ideologies you treat in the book and present relevant applications, would you survey for us the issue of college education, its costs, and most prominently, the recent student loan forgiveness program that was rolled out by the Biden administration, as well as its criticisms? Hopefully, you can help us understand what these ideologies are and how they might look at a particular topic like this from different points of view, and then also how perhaps we can sort of transcend any particular ideology and look at it in a more complete way. So take us from there.
Yes, certainly. I guess where I would want to start with that is that I think that particular issue needs to be put into the larger context of education in general.
Yeah.
So, if every civilization educates its children and its young people in some way.
Yeah.
It might not necessarily be formal schooling in the way that we know it in North America, in the Western world in general. But I'm thinking my late father apprenticed to a blacksmith in his village in
Oh, wow.
Cyprus. I'm
Yeah.
probably the only one alive who can say that, of his father. I'm only two generations removed from arranged marriage as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Their education itself, I think we need to look at as being part of a much larger framework
Yeah.
that is conditioned by the assumptions of particular civilizations. And these civilizations, as Samuel Huntington pointed out, are rooted in very basic religious beliefs that condition the way that we approach these matters. So I think when we're speaking of university education, I think we need to be aware that it's part of something much larger
Yeah.
than just universities. So and of course, the economic side of it is going to come into it as well. But I think that's a secondary consideration. Who is ultimately responsible for education? Going back to the ancient Greeks, there is an assumption that education belongs to the polis, to the city, and that
Yeah.
somehow the government is responsible for ensuring that citizens are educated in the virtues, to use this Aristotelian language.
And was that the polis is responsible in an exclusive sense or in a one role among many?
Well, that's a good question, because I think I think from the perspective of Plato and Aristotle, they would have seen the city as being a rather totalistic community. I hesitate to use the word totalitarian because that has certain connotations, for the 20th century. But parents were educating their children at that time. Plato and Aristotle both were involved in educating young people. Tradition says that Aristotle educated the young Alexander, who would go on to of Macedon, who would go on to conquer the known world as far as what we now know as Pakistan.
Yeah.
So when we look at education, we need to be aware of that, and that education is also rooted in certain worldviews. So is this something which is ultimately religiously neutral? Is it simply a matter of handing on technical capacities from one generation to the next. Well, that's part of it, but I don't think that's the whole of it. So when we look at something like university education, I think we need to be aware of the diversity of educational settings that we find in a mature differentiated society, such as we have here in the United States and Canada. Yeah, and I have to tell your audience that I'm just getting over COVID, so I have a bit of a residual cough. So if
Yeah,
you'll
yeah,
pardon me for just a
yeah,
moment. So depending on your view of education or where you think it fits into the larger society, that's going to condition the way that you would approach the subject of funding education. Um,
yeah,
if you look at universities as being arms of the government, then you're going to see that you're going to see that tax dollars should be used exclusively for universities that are arms of the government.
yeah.
I taught for 30 years at an independent Christian university here in Hamilton, but we have a neighboring university, which is a provincial university. It used
Yeah.
to be a Baptist university prior to 1957,
Mm.
but then it became a provincial university and it gets some government funding. So the issue of funding is going to be very important. If you are, for example, a liberal, if you adhere to liberal ideology, then you're going to look at education as a matter of primarily of trying to inculcate certain probably technical skills within the students, so that they can be good participatory members
Yeah.
of the larger
And
society
when you say
and of the
technical, do you mean
yeah.
did that imply just sort of a knowledge or an ability standpoint as opposed to the development of character in those particular people?
Yes, exactly. That's right. Yeah. So at one time, and this again goes back to Plato and Aristotle. There was a notion that education is there to develop character amongst the young. And as Plato in his Republic, set up this elaborate curriculum, in which he would be censoring the poets, presumably the Homeric epics and so forth, to try to build courage
Mhm.
in the guardian class and so forth. And Aristotle had this notion of virtue as being
Mhm.
necessary to the functioning of a polis, of one of these city states such as Athens. And so education was to be an arm of the city. It was supposed to educate, not mass education in the way that we think of it now, but at least those people who had the virtues to be citizens of their particular
Yeah.
cities.
So why would
Um,
the liberal ideology's point of view, why would they be more interested in the technical and less interested in the character development?
Yeah, and that's probably a more recent development, because I think if you would go back to somebody like John Locke and some of the early liberals, they would have seen that the building of character was a very significant thing. But as liberalism has developed over the centuries, especially I would say in the last 60 years, just in my lifetime, there has been a focus um, on what we might call the expansive self, on
Yeah.
uh, the uh, there's this notion that somehow our desires are to be released, and we are supposed to try to seek our desires as best we can. So
Yeah.
now we hear people telling young people, oh, follow your dreams, as if that's somehow supremely wise advice. I mean, that's all well and good that people are going to pursue their interests, to be sure, but from our generations, previous generations, they would have had no sense that their young people would be following their own dreams, because the lines are pretty much set. If your father was a blacksmith, then you would become a blacksmith too.
Yeah.
If your father was a tailor or a cobbler, you would become a tailor or a cobbler as well. But now there's this idea that somehow we want to realize ourselves, we want to authenticate ourselves, and I think that's motivating us. So how do we do that? Well, there are certain techniques that we need to acquire so that we can authenticate ourselves.
Mm.
And so the building of characters is very much less significant.
Mm. So there's almost, I guess, an implication that there's no need for that character development, right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
I think so, yes, yes. Or maybe even the assumption that there is such a thing as a character, a normative character, to which human beings, for which human beings ought to strive. That's come to be seen as a kind of a power play
Mm,
on the part of the powerful to try to get us in
yeah.
their grips, and that's where a certain kind of a crude sort of Marxism has come down into our present day as well.
Yeah. Well, I guess
Yeah.
part of that is sort of this idea that we're de I would argue from a standpoint of that we are dependent creatures. We are dependent on others. Whereas the liberal might say that I'm independent of others.
Yes.
And so for them to teach me character is to potentially oppress me, right?
I think so. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So how would the liberal ideology look at something like borrowing money for education and then also
Right.
the forgiveness of that education through the distribution of essentially having the government pay it through the
Right.
taxpayers? Mhm.
Different liberals will tell you different things.
Yeah.
So in my political visions and illusions, I trace the development of liberalism through five stages. So the first being the Hobbesian Commonwealth, the second being the Night Watchman state, the third being what I have called the regulatory state, the fourth being the equal opportunity state, and then the fifth being the choice enhancement state. And I think since about 1960, this is the stage that we're in at the present time, that somehow government intervenes to enhance our choices so that we have all of these options amongst which we can choose. Now, if you're a liberal who adheres to one of the earlier stages of that particular ideology, you're more likely to say that individuals should take responsibility for themselves. They should take responsibility for their own education.
Mhm.
If you're a late liberal, maybe a choice enhancement liberal or an equal opportunity liberal, you're going to say, well, government needs to intervene to try to equalize the playing field so that everybody has similar options in front of them.
Mhm.
And as to whether that has to do with student loans, whether the forgiveness of loans might come in some way, different liberals are going to tell you different things.
Yeah. And so how do you reconcile those differences um, when one liberal says one thing and another liberal says another, and you're essentially making the argument that they're the same, they're just different flavors of the same ice cream.
Yeah, well, I'm tempted to say, well, get your act together. But of course, in every political ideology, you're going to see that there's a tension at the very heart of it. A tension. There's going to be an inconsistency, and that will tend to drive the adherents of a single ideology apart into different camps.
Yeah.
So in the Western world, I think particularly in United States and Canada, we will see that liberalism frames the larger debate. I think this was really obvious in the 2000 presidential debates between George W. Bush and Al Gore. They were both untried. They were both running for the presidency, taking Bill Clinton's place. And there was I can't remember whether all the debates were like this, but there was one in which the moderator was sitting at a table, and they were sitting at the same table on either side, facing the audience. And more often than not, they would say, "Well, I agree with you, but I think we need to do it in this way." And that's where we saw that in many respects, their assumptions were the same between
Yeah.
Bush and Gore. Their assumptions were the same. They differed as to how to interpret those and
Mm,
which party would be the better party at implementing those principles. Now there's a very much more polarization than there was 20 years ago. Sad to say, but it's not. They're not polarized around deep principles.
yeah.
They distrust each other, but the framework is still largely a liberal framework. And how are we going to get to these goals of liberating the individual? And
Yeah.
that's what they differ on. And they've come to distrust each other as well.
Mm. So let's take another one of the ideologies. We won't have time to go into all of them, but what would be another one to kind of look through the lens? I mean, you kind of mentioned a little bit about like traditionalism and conservatism, some history in terms of how they see education, but what would be whether that one or one of the others that has a distinct way of looking at education and both how it's paid for and how student loans and forgiveness might play a part?
Right, right. Well, one of the ideologies that I treat in my book, I've labeled democratism. Democratism is I don't think I've invented the word, but if you try to put it in your spell checks, the spell check won't recognize it.
Yeah.
So, but it's, I think in the first edition of Political Visions and Illusions that came out in 2003, I called it Democracy as an Ideology or Democracy as Creed. But then in order to make it parallel with liberalism, with all of these other
Yeah.
isms, I came up with democratism. If you are really a believer in um, the goodness, maybe the holiness of democracy, then you are going to look at education as a matter of raising up democratic citizens that will be able to exercise the democratic responsibilities. And so that means that very likely government is going to be a major role player in ensuring that young people are educated for citizenship.
So how would someone who's kind of enthralled by democracy, democratism, how would they see the difference between or the assumption that should everyone go to college or not? And I could see quickly, how that would sort of, there probably is an underlying tension there that's, well, everyone should share the cost because it's a democracy type of mentality, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah, and I think that would get us closer, I think, into socialism, because socialism, you're going to find that those people who follow socialism will make an even stronger case for pooling costs and evening out the costs as possible, not only for education but for a whole variety a whole variety of goods that societies might value. So not just education, but arguably maybe even in the distribution of medical care, for example. In Canada, we have universal medical care on a province by province basis, to be sure, but that's different from the United States at the present time. The founder of Medicare in Canada was a man by the name of Tommy Douglas. He was the premier of Saskatchewan for many years. He was the first national leader of the New Democratic Party, and that's basically Canada's Democratic Socialist Party. And if you're an adherent of that party, you are going to want as much as possible for people to pool costs, and that means that basically government would take the initiative in encouraging, well, mandating people to pool costs in a variety of areas.
Yeah. So when this student forgiveness program is unrolled and revealed, we get all these different responses from all these different groups. And so how do you make sense of that through this ideological lens?
Yeah. Well, I think those people who are the old-fashioned type of liberals are going to be less enthralled with this notion of the forgiveness of student debt. And there is something to that. It's not clear, forgiveness of debt. Uh, the money has to come from somewhere. And
Yeah.
I think this is something that probably the old-fashioned, the older style liberals probably have made a point. Where is
Yeah.
the money going to come from? It isn't as though the banks are forgiving the debts. If they did, then it would come out of presumably out of the depositors'
Yeah.
bank books. So it's but this time it seems as though it's going to come out of tax dollars. So that's going to, it's not clear to the mass of citizenry that this is going to be of benefit for everybody. Is it going to benefit only those who are university educated? What about those people who have entered a trade, become electrician or a plumber, or something along those lines? My late grandfather, maternal grandfather, was an worked on an automobile assembly line in Pontiac, Michigan.
Yeah.
And that was one of the skilled trades, as it were. And he was very proud of his trade. Big union man. And what about what about people like that? What are they going to think about the forgiveness of student loans? So if one type of liberal would say, yeah, let's be careful about this, because it's not really forgiveness, because the money is going to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's kind of shift gears and I think one of the things, the critique that you're making in the book is to imply that these ideologies, which you kind of from a Christian's point of view say that by placing them as superior, they become an idolatry. But the argument is that they do tell us some part of the story, but they're incomplete.
That's
So
right.
how would we look at this
Yeah.
particular issue, or any issue for that matter, in a non-ideological way, that also is practical in the sense that we're also considering these different facets that people are either their grievances, concerns, and questions about these particular complex problems and solutions.
Right, right, right. Well, you have to do it with a great deal of care,
Yeah,
and one of the things that I think is true of the ideologies that I treat in my book, and even ones that I don't treat in my book. I don't treat anarchism, I don't treat syndicalism. I mentioned fascism, although that's not a major focus
yeah,
of the book, is that they come up with too easy solutions.
mm,
They come up with too easy solutions. They tend to throw slogans at problems, whereas in the real world, the idea of doing justice in the real world in a complex, differentiated society means that those who are responsible for seeing that justice is done, public justice within the larger society, they have to weigh very carefully the different interests in the balance. So
yeah,
if we're thinking about an interest like forgiveness of student loans, we need to be, don't say, well, we want to free these the people who are in debt. We want to free them from their debts, and that's a good. Okay, well, maybe it is, but there are other considerations that need to be weighed in the balance as well. Has the Biden administration weighed these other considerations in the balance? Who is doing the actual forgiving? Is it the banks? Is it the government? Is it the taxpayers? And are different considerations being taken into account before this decision has been made? And I think
mm,
there may be reason to doubt that's the case.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I guess how would you like I think part of what I see is that there are these overly simplistic explanations or solutions proposed, and that our society is vastly complex, overly complex, more complex than any of us, most individuals, can really comprehend. And so how do we navigate that complexity in a wise way?
Well, I think we need to begin by listening to as many voices as we possibly can.
Yeah,
That's why I think this is where the whole notion of politics comes in. The politics, a lot of politics is not a matter of talking and making your
mm,
opinion known, but of sitting down and hearing people out. For a bill is even introduced into Congress or into the House of Commons, for example, here in Canada. There may be hearings that are held on a particular proposal, on a particular policy,
mm,
and different interest groups will be summoned to have their say on this particular issue. And that's all received as information by the decision makers. They have to weigh all of that. Of course, there are interests are going to clash. There's no doubt about it. Interests are going to clash, not because people are evil necessarily, but because people have limited vision. You can only see so far on either side of you. From my basement office here, there are a lot of things I can't see in the house. I don't know exactly what my wife is doing. I'm not sure what my daughter is doing or what our neighbors are doing. So you have to listen to people. You have to be willing to hear people, representatives of different interests. This is why we have elections, so that citizens can have their voices heard at that very basic level. But even after elections, when it comes time to concrete policy making, different groups, different interests have to be heard, and that's all part of the process of doing justice.
yeah,
Now, if you're in the throes of a particular ideology, you may find yourself thinking, this is what justice requires. This is what we're going to do come hell or high water. And you're not going to listen to people. You're going to say, well, this is justice. This is the just thing to do.
yeah,
And too often, I think the people who style themselves, I hesitate to use this term, but social justice warriors,
yeah,
are too willing. They too easily jump to conclusions. They
mm,
they 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 um um they uh, they rush to judgment.
Yeah.
And in so doing, they run the grave risk of miscarrying justice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can, I can relate to that even personally, just feeling overwhelmed by a particular problem and wanting to act, and sometimes recognizing in that retrospect that how I act actually made the problem worse. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And of course that's a big risk with any government actor. You know,
Yeah.
there's a real risk of making problems worse.
Yeah. And the conflict is not just between the different ideologies, but one of the things that stuck out in the book for me was how you sort of framed each ideology as a spectrum, being on one side conservative and another side progressive. So you have
Oh yeah.
conservative liberals and you have progressive liberals, conservative nationalists and progressive nationalists. So explain to us what that's going on there, and how that works, because I feel like that was a hugely clarifying
Yeah.
framework for me to sort of look at things.
Right. I think it was. I'm going to quote from my book, but I'm also going to quote from Alistair McIntyre, whom I quote in the book, who said that the main debates today take place between conservative liberals and what did he say? Progressive liberals and maybe radical liberals. I can't remember exactly the terms that he uses, but there were three categories, but they all fall within that larger liberal framework. In much of what goes by the conservative label in the United States, and since the beginning of the century, increasingly in Canada as well, really is a kind of old-fashioned liberalism.
Yeah.
So a lot of what we see, I'm old enough to remember, I guess Barry Goldwater when he ran for the presidency in 1964. I remember my parents. Um, they generally voted Republican, but they didn't like him. And I remember them
Yeah.
getting into an argument as to what to do about this Goldwater character. That neither one of
Yeah.
them really liked. But he was much more of a kind of libertarian
Mm.
type of a figure, a polarizing figure in many respects, which Eisenhower had not been. Eisenhower was very much a consensus type of a figure in the 1950s, and
Yeah.
but a lot of what goes by the conservative label in the United States is really a kind of old-fashioned liberalism,
Yeah.
and there are people who have tried to define conservatism, have tried to put substance within a conservative vision. I just recently published a review of a book by Yoram Hazony, an American Israeli political philosopher, and it's called Conservatism: A Rediscovery. Delightful book, a wonderful book in many
Yeah.
respects, but I wasn't entirely convinced by his effort to put substance, the principles within conservatism, because conservatism is too it's too flexible.
Yeah.
It's too capacious. It includes too much
Yeah.
to be able to find, you know, um, um,
I mean,
um,
you said in the book, you have to
yeah,
ask yourself, what are you trying to conserve?
exactly. That's right. Yeah.
And I think a lot of conservatism that just after reading your book, I kind of started to think about it. I think it may be more often labeled as like traditionalism in a way.
Yeah, that's right. And traditionalism, at least you know what you're conserving. It's
Yeah.
a tradition. And whose tradition? Well, it's going
Yeah.
to be our tradition.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get an American conservative trying to defend 19th century Russian autocracy,
Yeah.
Russian Orthodoxy and nationality, which
Yeah.
was Tsar Nicholas the First's slogan. You're not going to get American conservatives doing that. But you're
But
not.
it does seem to create like these weird like Frankenstein monsters, because
Yeah.
whatever is being conserved is usually a hodgepodge of different traditions.
Oh, it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's right. Yeah.
And they're not necessarily
Yeah.
coherent with each other either.
No,
In
that's
fact,
right.
they're
Yeah.
at odds in a lot of cases.
They
Yeah.
are, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
Canada, we have in Canada, we just laid to rest our queen,
Yeah.
and honestly, I didn't think I would shed as many tears as I did.
Mm.
My wife and daughter were very moved by the memorial services that were held at St. Giles Cathedral and the
Yeah.
Westminster Abbey, and the St. George's, Windsor. Very moved by these, but you won't see American conservatives saying we need to get a monarchy.
Yeah.
We need to restore the monarchy because that's simply not part of the American tradition.
Yeah.
Canada, yes, but not the United
Yeah.
States.
At least in that form. Maybe there's hope for an alternative variation. But I think the other funny thing is that the whole idea that we're talking about conservative and progressive liberals who would consider themselves as like the left and the right, but are actually mirrors of each other. It kind of it's ironic that they have such they can have such disdain for each other, but in a way it's their own reflection in the mirror. Does that make sense?
It is, yeah, and I think it's also true that intra-family squabbles can be worse,
Yeah,
than friends falling out with each other.
yeah,
So there's a sense in which your family, the members of your family, they're with you for life. You can't get rid of them.
yeah,
Friends, you can presumably say, oh, and friends are falling out of friendship all the time. Family, it's more difficult, and I think that's one of the reasons why in the United States at the present time, to much lesser extent in Canada, although I think there are some disquieting elements even here as well. But in the States, you have such polarization, so that it could break out in actual violence
yeah,
almost 2 years ago. Just a horrendous thing.
yeah. And
Yeah.
I think there's something about like the ideology having its logical conclusions that people don't follow to their place. I think Friedrich Nietzsche kind of was trying to do that. Like, hey, I'm going to take these assumptions and take them to their end, and let's see where we go.
That's right, and I will say that most followers of ideologies are better than their ideologies.
Mm-hmm.
So that they're not willing to take the logic of their beliefs to their full extent. Now, there are some people like Hitler and Stalin and so forth, that are willing to do that at the cost of scores of
Yeah,
millions of lives. Chairman Mao Zedong was probably the worst mass murderer in history,
yeah,
just because there were more Chinese to kill off.
yeah,
Just again, terrible thing. But the vast majority of people, even people, Canadian socialists, are not willing to take the logic of their socialist convictions to the full extent. So they're willing to engage in a limited sort of reality check.
yeah,
And so if their principles do not match the reality, most people are willing to modify those principles
yeah,
if they recognize that they're going to hurt people if they
mhm,
try to implement them to the full
yeah.
extent.
Which implies that they at least somewhat recognize that something has to be superior to these things in order to properly order them, right?
That's right. That's something that Abraham Kuyper called common grace,
Yeah,
God's common grace. That he makes his rain to fall on the just and the unjust alike.
yeah,
Even those people who are not believers benefit from his grace in a certain minimal sense, that we all share God's creation.
yeah. So I want to kind of go a little deeper. So we've talked about like these ideologies and how it affects education and student loans and that issue. But if we go deeper, I want to talk about the foundation of America, particularly the United States of America. So you mentioned Alistair McIntyre. So he called the Enlightenment a failed project. But it's also a project that gave birth to the ideology of liberalism in many ways. So I'm curious, what is your thought about America's founding, and maybe the Western countries more broadly? Um, how much are they based on some of these flawed liberal assumptions and ideologies? Can these be rectified? What is at the end of the book, you explore the idea of pluriformity. Um, how does that tie into this, and how would you differentiate pluriformity from liberal pluralism? A lot to throw at you. So
Yeah, well, let's start with the first one. If you can repeat the first one again, the question,
yeah.
and just
So is America, or more broadly the Western countries, are they
yes,
founded
okay.
on flawed assumptions and ideologies which need to
um,
be rectified?
that's right, and I would say yes and no.
Yeah,
So there are some people that say, well, the American founding was flawed, and therefore we have to scrap the whole thing and start over. At least that seems to be the implication that we have from it. I would say the American founding was flawed in many respects, but that's not the only element. So if you think about the why Americans were fighting in the it's called the American Revolution, but it really was the American War for Independence. That's really what it was. It wasn't a revolution in the same sense as the French Revolution was a few years later.
yeah,
It wasn't there was no attempt to try to rebuild society upon rational principles and get rid of all of the traditions of the past. That wasn't part of the American effort. What happened in the United States is that really right up until 1776, Americans, they were willing to stick with the king. And their beef was really with the British Parliament, which they saw as interfering in colonial affairs. They were willing to recognize the king, but in the same way that, in Canada we recognize the Queen, but we
Yeah.
don't recognize the British Parliament. We have our own
Uh,
parliament here in Canada. So that's been the case since 1931 with the Statute of Westminster, which created the Commonwealth of Nations.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well, Americans, if they can be faulted for anything, it's for the assumption that the Commonwealth of Nations already existed in the 18th century. So they said, we are independent. We are in a personal union with Great Britain and Ireland and Hanover. We recognize the same king, but the British Parliament doesn't have any more business in our affairs than it does in the affairs of Hanover.
Yeah.
Which the British king was also ruling at the time, or reigning over. So that's what Americans were doing at the time. You wouldn't have to be necessarily a liberal or any kind of an ideologue to recognize that that Americans wanted to be in charge of their own affairs, and they had been up until the Parliament decided they wanted to tax the colonials to pay for the 7 Years' War.
Mm.
But you can't deny the fact that the Declaration of Independence, penned largely by Thomas Jefferson, and then of course it went to a committee, and the committee edited it, and put it into its final form. Jefferson was very much influenced by John Locke, and he was one of the inventors of Anglo-Saxon liberalism. The idea that if a particular government, that we set up a government, if it doesn't do what we want it to, then we have the right to withdraw our consent. He put it very much in Lockean language, although not Americans were necessarily thinking in Lockean language.
Yeah. So, I mean, does that imply that there's some liberal base assumptions in some of those undergirding foundings that are actually leading us astray? Like, I think, like, more specifically, like, America is very autonomous as a country amongst the world, but we're also very autonomous individuals, and a lot of that seems to be the spirit of what it means to be American. But in some ways, that's contradictory to the type of humans we are.
Yeah,
That type of autonomy.
It very much is. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think that notion of autonomy, of individual autonomy, was present at the very beginning.
Yeah.
In the end of the 18th century, it was there.
Yeah.
But there were always what we might call a communitarian spirit that helped to mitigate that in large measure. So if you think of people living in the small towns, barn raisings and so forth, and the sorts of quilting bees, and people getting together to engage in all of these shared activities.
Things we would still see, like in like the Amish community, like they
Oh
still
yeah,
do those
absolutely.
things. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. That would knit people together. But it seems as though over the last 250 years, it seems as though that individualism has just corroded many of those traditions, those more communitarian traditions, until now we have this notion of expressive individualism, is the way that Charles Taylor and others have put it. I have a right to express myself. I have a right to this. I have a right to that. And too bad for anybody who gets in my way.
Yeah. And also the source of where we derive those values as well. I can't remember what he uses these two words, but like whether the source is from within us or from an outside source, and the shift in our culture where it's becoming more inside of ourselves that we find answers, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I would say that's the Hobbesian element. Thomas Hobbes was a 17th century political philosopher in England. He wrote this book called Leviathan, and he was an individualist to the core.
Yeah.
He believed that everybody is basically out for him or herself. That everybody is motivated by the desire to survive, and everybody is in competition with everybody else. And it seems as though that's the direction that we've moved today. The founders in the 18th century believed that that there needed to be traditions that would hold the community together. That liberalism wasn't enough. But now it's as though liberalism has just expanded. It's taken over so much of the political landscape. It's almost as though we don't care for our neighbor anymore.
Yeah. Well,
I
I
don't think
also,
that's literally true. I don't think that's
yeah,
literally true. But you know, it's you can more easily hear people saying that than you could, for example, in my parents' or grandparents' generation.
yeah. Although I think it kind of ties to what you said earlier about the kind of the reality check. I think historically we needed each other more, and now everything is with technology and scale and scope. We kind of don't need our neighbors the way that we used to, and that reality shift, it changes how we perceive ourselves and how we act, right?
It does, and it's interesting because I think about you know, I think about my mother's generation, you know, growing up in the 1930s and the 40s, and I think they would go to the movies about twice a week because there was always a new movie that was showing. And you know, this was before television. There was radio and so forth, but people in the town, they would go to the movies and they would see the movies together. Now, what is it? They're streaming movies on Netflix, you know. So now you don't even go to
Yeah,
Blockbuster and rent a video and see your, oh hi, you know,
yeah,
which video you're picking up. Now you're streaming everything on Netflix or
yeah,
Disney Channel or one of these streaming services. You don't need to see anybody. You know,
yeah,
it's not healthy, and the pandemic has only exacerbated it.
yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that's where yeah, those natural dynamics that helped us towards healthy interrelational dynamics
yeah,
are shifting. I also wonder if some of those are being driven by these ideologies, in the sense that, you know, the way that we're designing them, the way we do social media,
yeah,
it's designed with these ideologies underlying, whether we realize it or not, as a logical conclusion of the ideology. How do you
yes,
see that?
yeah. No, it's true. There was uh, a Canadian philosopher by the name of George Parkin Grant. He died about oh goodness, I think it's almost 35 years ago now. I had the opportunity to meet him on two occasions in the late 1970s, and he taught at McMaster University here in Hamilton. And he was very down on technology, probably excessively so. But he wrote this essay. What is it? The computer does not determine how it will be used, you know, and he's trying to break through the idea. This is in sort of the infancy of personal computers, trying to break through the idea that a computer is simply a kind of neutral tool that we can use for whatever we want to use it for. Now there's something to that, you know, because computers are subject to good use and also bad use as well. But in many respects, I think the way that we have things set up, it's fragmented, and it's
Yeah,
almost as though this liberal ideology, which has been in North America for a very long time, you know, it's pushed us in the direction of fragmentation. So now
yeah,
you can see people at I don't know, maybe at the Christmas table, looking at their phones, you know, and not
yeah,
talking with each other. You know, that's the stuff of cartoons and so forth. And I hope that doesn't literally happen, but um, yeah, there are dangers.
yeah. And with that technological advance, we have to intentionally choose to do those things versus being more integrated into the way of life. And as humans, we're just, some of us will maybe learn those lessons and enforce those things, but eventually we sort of fall into the currents that the dynamics create.
Yes, oh, it's quite true. That's right. Yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
So so how does you talk about pluriformity as a sort of a
yeah.
form of society, and um how do we how 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 much is America like that, and how
Yeah,
could we become more effective in that approach?
yeah. Well, pluriformity is I don't think I invented the word, but again, my spell checks don't know what to do with it. I have to, you know, add it manually to the database, I guess, of words. But pluriformity simply means that our societies are diverse. You know, not diverse in the way that, you know, we have these diversity, equity, inclusion type of things, you know, but diverse in the sort of social formations that characterize our society. You know, so if you're a consistent liberal, you want to say, well, you know, communities are simply fictions that are created by individuals coming together. You know,
Yeah,
so there's really no essential difference between a classroom and a family because they're both made up of individuals. You know,
yeah,
whereas um, you know, from in this very broad, intuitive way, we can sense the distinction, the differences, between a family and a classroom, for
Yeah.
example, or between a church and a state, between a chess club and a
Mm,
and a marriage. We don't, on this very intuitive level, we recognize that there's a whole diversity of social formations around us, some of which have this very significant institutional character, others of which literally are voluntary associations.
yeah.
But liberalism tries to reduce everything, even institutions, to mere voluntary associations.
Mm,
And that goes,
yeah.
it not only, it goes against reality, it goes against our experience of reality, because we see all this diversity around us. When I'm looking at my office and I look at the things that are on the wall and the books, I'm not just seeing atoms that happen to be
Yeah.
coagulated into particular forms. I'm seeing the forms themselves. I'm seeing a book in front of me right now. This is the University Press's version of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. I've been
Ah,
looking at that quite a lot, with the Queen's
oh,
um,
okay. Yeah.
uh, memorial services and all of that. But I'm not just seeing atoms that happen to be formed into molecules that are forming into objects. I'm seeing the things themselves.
Yeah.
And there's this, and that's what society is like. We're not just seeing individuals who happen to be coming together from their own free wills, to form whatever it is, an association, but we're seeing real communities.
Yeah, and so to your point about the fragmentation then, and the fact that we've sort of exploded and we're all over the place. I think about, being in the business world, and working with companies and being a business owner and all that. Um, I recognize that fragmentation happens in companies too, and maybe just a practical way that plays out is a worker. Let's say you've got a company with a couple hundred people and they got different departments. A worker doesn't realize how their role and their tasks affect the mission of the company. They're disconnected. And I think in the same way, what I'm hearing from you is that's the case with our country. And so one of the many solutions we probably need is for someone to communicate how we're interconnected and how those pieces come together and how those help us move forward. And I
I think
think
so.
and the other thing I would
Yeah,
add to that is I think your mentioning of the Queen
yeah.
passing and her symbolic role as sort of casting the vision. I think that's a type of role that sort of helps bring people together. What would you
It
say to that?
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, it is. It very definitely is, and it seems like whenever there's some kind of a royal event, somebody, usually in the Toronto Star, maybe the Globe and Mail, will publish and saying, well, it's time to get rid of the monarchy. It's time to end the monarchy.
Yeah.
And I'm not, up until now, I wouldn't have said I'm not a sentimental monarchist. I was actually born and raised in the United States. But then after this past week, I'm kind of wondering, well, maybe I am a sentimental monarchist. I don't know, because I was really quite moved by the passing of the Queen, and honestly, as they were singing "God Save the Queen" at the committal service, yeah, "God Save the King" rather, at the committal service. I have to get used to the words. Um, I thought King Charles. It looked like he was trying very hard not to cry.
Yeah.
That's what I saw. And how can anybody fail to be affected by that?
Mhm.
Canadians, but Australians, New Zealanders, Britons alike. And
Yeah.
I think that's a very powerful. Um, I think when an American president dies, you won't see the same kind of emotion on the part of Americans. I just don't
Yeah.
think you'll see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the difference? What is America missing then?
Well,
In that particular regard, I know in a recent blog post you kind of talked about the
yeah,
president, and there's no distinction in America between the head of state and the head of government. So I don't know.
exactly. No, that's right. Yeah, and that's something that I've been persuaded of for a long time, that the lack of the distinction between the head of state and the head of government is, I don't know that it's fatal necessarily, but it means that when Joe Biden gave his speech about MAGA Republicans and about the threat of violence to democracy, he said things that needed to be said. But the mere fact that a politician who's embedded in party politics made those statements means that he's not going to convince a lot of people,
Yeah.
probably the very people that need to be convinced.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember there was a speech Obama gave during the 2020 election cycle.
Yeah.
and 80% of it was just really good, but then 20% of it was hyper partisan, and I felt like,
I
oh,
know.
if he just didn't do that part, I think it would have been more captivating for a
I
larger,
know.
broader audience.
I know. Yeah, and part of the thing, Obama in particular, he came to office in 2008, and as on the strength of his kingly qualities,
Yeah,
because he and Michelle, they both have these regal qualities. The Kennedys have it.
yeah,
John and Jackie Kennedy. My one of my earliest political memories was the assassination of John Kennedy, and that I was 8 years old, and I cried. I was upset along with everybody else, and very vivid memories of this time, almost 60 years ago, when this happened. But when Obama came to office, on the strength of his kingly abilities, and he was magnificent. He had this deep resonating voice. He was saying all the right things, but then he began to pursue, hopelessly divisive policies,
yeah,
which alienated a lot of Americans.
yeah,
And that and the lack of a regal figure, I think is really that's one of the flaws in the American system from my perspective.
yeah. And
Yeah,
and it seems like America, particularly through the pandemic year and those that have followed, there is a leadership void at that level, and
yeah,
and
yeah,
it's got consequences. So I guess,
yeah.
yeah, that kind of, to take that one step further into this idea of sovereignty. um you know we're talking about sort of the symbolic leadership and then the actual leadership in these particular issues, but at the core level, like, where is sovereignty derived from, and how does different countries with different levels of sovereignty interact
Right.
with each other, and who's to say that one is sovereign over the other, or vice versa? How would you
That's
reconcile that?
Yeah, that's right. That has been debated by political philosophers for the last 500 years.
Yeah,
From the time of Hobbes, who spoke of the sovereign. The sovereign
yeah,
is this all-powerful figure who has the ability to keep everybody in line and to put an end to this war of all against all.
yeah,
And and the mainstream of Western political philosophy for the last 500 years has been to concentrate sovereignty in a particular person or institution.
mm,
So it's either Parliament. Parliamentary sovereignty is the key British constitutional principle. Or else popular sovereignty. That takes us back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, the French revolutionaries. Popular sovereignty. Abraham Kuyper, the Dutch polymath. He was a Christian. He was prime minister of the Netherlands between 1901 and 1905. Somebody whom I admire a great deal, and who has been very influential on the books and the various articles that I've written. He spoke of something called sphere sovereignty.
yeah.
A very inelegant term which I would not have invented myself. This is why I use the term pluriformity, and
Yeah.
that's probably inelegant too, I suppose. But the idea that the ultimate sovereignty belongs to God,
Yeah,
and that He delegates His authority to various agents, in within His creation.
yeah,
So individuals, but also institutions, also leadership within communities and institutions and so forth. So sovereignty is not derived. The parental authority is not derived from state sovereignty,
yeah,
as some people might want to think, and that's going
yeah,
to condition your approach to education as well. That takes us back
mm,
to our first topic
yeah.
of discussion. But yeah,
So
but
how,
we but I think as believers, we are willing to recognize this diversity, that this pluriformity, and we're not
yeah,
threatened by it
mm,
as the adherents of ideologies are. Because they
okay,
see chaos. We don't see chaos. We simply see people, people that are made in God's image, who have formed communities, and these communities are pursuing their own interests as they understand them.
yeah,
And we do need some kind of an institution that will coordinate these in some fashion. That's where public justice comes in. This is where government comes in. And but we're not afraid to allow the family to be the family, to allow
yeah,
marriage to be marriage, to allow a school to be a school, etc., etc.
yeah. And I think also what you're implying is, as Christians, particularly, um, we can operate within any system that's going to be out there, that's going to shift and move and change in ways that maybe we don't like, or maybe that are problematic for us or even harmful. But ultimately, our foundation transcends the societal system we're in, right?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So, you know, I don't think we could ever say that one particular governmental system is the Christian or
Yeah.
the biblical governmental system, you know, and I can't think of anybody who has actually said that, you know.
Yeah.
You know, most people believed that, you know, well up into the 19th and 20th centuries, that the best constitution was a form of mixed constitution that would embody the best of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, you know,
Yeah.
while not letting any one of those get the upper hand. And
Hmm.
in many respects, I think the American founders were operating within that tradition when they wanted to have these three branches of government, none of which could claim sovereignty. You
Yeah.
know, so it was a kind of shared sovereignty, and I think they were right about that. In that respect, they were not establishing a democracy pure and simple, but they were establishing a mixed constitution that would have democratic elements. I think
Yeah.
that's true of our fathers of Confederation a century later here in Canada as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for so much for sharing. I guess we can go ahead and start wrapping up. The
Okay.
book's Political Visions and Illusions. You can get it on Amazon. Um, you wrote this, you published this in 2019. Is there anything you would add or emphasize in the last 3 or 4 years that, um, I know this is the second edition, so you did quite an update to the first one, which I only read the second, so I don't know how different it is, but
Sure.
I assume it is.
Yeah. It is, yeah. There were quite a few changes. I think probably too little time has passed. It's only been about 3 years since the second edition came out. But I think the biggest uh, event that happened between then and now, I think, is the pandemic,
Yeah.
because that's changed things. You know, the mere fact that you and I are talking this way,
Yeah.
you know, we probably wouldn't have done that if it had not been for the pandemic. You know,
Yeah.
so I was in March of 2020. I was scheduled to do a synth teaching at a Baptist seminary in North Carolina,
Yeah.
and you know, and then that was in March of 2020. At that, you know, just the week before, they started imposing these lockdowns because of COVID, and so that was canceled. But then all of a sudden, and this was something that I hadn't expected, all of these invitations started pouring in for me,
Yeah.
and so my work took off after the pandemic took hold, because you know
Mm.
my book was translated into Portuguese
Oh, wow.
in yeah, in 2014, and then
Okay.
the second edition just came out last year, and then it came out in a Spanish language edition just in May of this year. So
Wow. That's
yeah,
cool.
so now I'm getting invitations from Brazil, mostly from Brazil, but also from Chile, a few other places as well. I've had connections in Ukraine as well. You know, I'm praying for these people because in the middle of this war and everything. But I think the pandemic has changed so much. You know,
Yeah.
so you know, all of a sudden, people in Brazil thought we don't have to pay to fly him down here and billet him. You know, we can have him speak to us remotely,
Yeah.
and you know, every month I have several of these sorts of speaking engagements or conversations with people such as yourself.
Yeah.
So it's and that's changed. And you know,
Hmm.
honestly, I think it's too soon to say what the political ramifications will be of this.
Yeah.
But I'm in the process of putting together a proposal for a sequel to
Yeah.
Political Visions and Illusions I am calling um, Citizenship Without Illusions.
Mm.
So, you know, and I'm going to deal with what I think is one of the implications of the pandemic. But even before that, it has more to do with the rise of social media, and I call it the virtual illusion.
Mm.
The virtual illusion, and stay tuned because there's more
Yeah.
coming on that. I've already published an article about that you can
Okay.
look up online, but yeah, I think this is something that is becoming clear to me in recent years.
Yeah. That's cool. Is there anything else you wanted to share about the book that we didn't get a chance to cover
Um,
specifically?
yeah, I can't think of anything at the moment.
Okay.
I have to be careful because I'm constantly on the verge of coughing as I'm
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
getting rid of the last symptoms of COVID and so forth. But
Okay.
yeah,
Well,
it's
how can if people want to follow you, connect with you on social media, to
Yeah,
how can they find your work, your writings, your social
yeah.
interactions?
I'm very easy to find. I have a one of a kind last name, Koyzis, Koyzis, a Z if you're American. But it's a name that I think my father was born only with a patronymic in the island of Cyprus. He didn't have a last name, but when he went to this school that was run by Americans, they wanted everybody to have a first, middle, and last name.
Yeah.
So the name Koyzis really as a fixed surname goes back only to 1943. So you can find me, but I have a blog called Notes from a Byzantine Rite Calvinist.
Where does that name come from?
Well, it comes from basically I'm a Reformed Christian, but the Byzantine is a reference to my paternal ancestors' Greek Orthodox religion.
Okay.
Yes. So I'm
Cool.
pretty easy to find that way. Just do a Google search or whatever, and you'll find
Okay.
me.
And what social channels are you most active on?
Well, on Facebook, you can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram, on Twitter, um, on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. I'll put links to
Yes,
all those in the notes and people
great,
can
great.
access that. So, well, thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I was pleased to be here, Jason.